migration of British subjects. While they were encouraged to migrate through their recruitment in imperial service, the army, railways, or plantations, they were prevented from exercising their rights to migrate to any part of the British Empire as free workers. The movements from Punjab differed from those in other parts of India in their movements of free workers and the Punjabis' feeling of being entitled to a privileged treatment as loyal soldiers of the imperial army, a feeling that was fostered by the British themselves through the construction of different racial stereotypes. The incident also foregrounded a contradiction that lay at the heart of the empire. It demonstrated the British government's treatment of its loyal subjects. As Johnson points out, that would be this Johnson, the seditious sentiments displayed by Sikhs overseas were in contrast to the loyalty of Sikhs at home and in the service of the army, and Sikh resistance to authority was appropriated by militant movements led by Indian nationalists in San Francisco and elsewhere. While Canada introduced the continuous journey regulation to control the Asian invasion, the British concern with the movements of Sikhs and the Ghadar revolutionaries explained their shadowing the passage of the ship as individual passengers. For those of you who don't know what Ghadar is, it was a revolutionary movement that started in the US and also in Canada in the early 1900s. On its return to Budge, the arrest of its passengers without conclusive evidence of their Ghadar involvement and monitoring of their activities in their home villages for several years shows the domestic, in addition to internal regulations, through which immobility regimes regulate flows of people. The British Indian immobility regime regulated the flows of its subjects through a new legislation called the Ingress Act, I-N-G-R-E-S-S, Ingress Act, which gave the British government powers to arrest persons deemed dangerous. The release of confidential material on the British Indian government's list of dangerous persons aboard the Kamagata Maru and its plans to arrest them on their arrival in Calcutta justifies the apprehensions Gurjit Singh, who chartered the ship, the Kamagata Maru, and his followers had about the actions of the government. Next subtitle is Paradigm of Suspicion. One of the reasons for the rise of enclave society has been securitization, the reason cited by the imperial state to restrict movements of persons who were considered as a threat to the security of empire in the view of the impending war. Turner refers to Shamir's notion of the paradigm of suspicion, quote, in which certain categories of persons are deemed to be dangerous, and hence their movements need to be contained and curtailed. That should sound similar to a lot of what's happening in our society today in the war on terrorism. During the war years, the Sikhs were a category of persons deemed to be dangerous, whose movements were followed by the imperial government. The precautions taken by the British to plant agents reporting on the progress of the ship at every port of call, in addition to those at the final destination, confirms the paradigm of suspicion that structured the state's relations with the Sikhs during the period. The assumption behind the Sikhs being regarded as dangerous was that every Sikh was radicalized. The state's actions in the Kamagata Maru episode appear to be predicted on the criminalization of law-abiding subjects of the empire through suggesting that they were engaged in seditious activities. The Punjabi narratives of economic and military migration are complicated by the emergence of the militant movement of Ghadar in the Pacific coast in the war years, led by intellectuals in which ordinary Sikhs played a key role. Considering that the Kamagata Maru set sail for Vancouver a few months after the formation of the Ghadar Party, with a strong Sikh participation and its consolidation through transnational Sikh networks, and that the war loomed ahead, the British administration understandably felt justified in monitoring the movements of Sikhs. However, testimonies of passengers and Ghadar accounts strongly contest the official documents that presume premeditated acts of violence. The motive of the majority of passengers boarding the Kamagata Maru appears to have been economic rather than political. Whether the passengers on the Kamagata Maru were committed to the Ghadar cause when they boarded the ship or not, there is evidence to prove that many of them converted to the movement following their internment, and that the incident was appropriated in the Ghadar movement. On their return, they might have been transformed into revolutionaries as much by their contact with Ghadar leaders as by the treatment they received at the hands of Canadian authorities. In other words, they became revolutionaries as a result of it. It is quite possible that the travelers' experience after the discrimination they faced altered their perspectives as it did of the last surviving Ghadar member, Bhagat Singh Bilga, who writes, "We went to earn a living and brought back a revolution," says Bilga in 2009 for the publication of While his financial worth establishes Gurjit Singh as a person of substance with a strong business acumen and political connections, his motives for chartering the ship are believed to have been motivated as much by philanthropism as by commercial considerations. Yet the financial and personal risks that he took, as well as the strategic moves he makes to ensure the accomplishment of the voyage's objective, betrays an independent spirit and a political will. Gurjit Singh's undertaking of the journey to ascertain if the subjects of the British Empire were equal and could move and work anywhere they wished to owes as much to the older history of Sikh resistance to the British in Malaya, dating back to Bhai Maharaj Singh, as to the new Ghadar movement. There is no doubt that Ghadar networks extended to Hong Kong. Ghadar members in San Francisco were in contact with those in Shanghai, Malaya, Burma, and elsewhere, and communicated with one another at a speed that was astounding in the days of poor or no connectivity. However, while Gurjit Singh might have been in touch with Ghadar members, he does not appear to be an active member prior to the sailing of the Kamagata Maru. In a way different and yet similar to his passengers, Gurjit Singh transformed from a shrewd businessman to a highly respected political leader during the course of the voyage, and eventually into a symbol of the transnational political movement for the liberation of India. The records of some of the Kamagata Maru passengers indeed confirm their better leadings. While some leaders like Bhagwant Singh and Barkatullah had addressed the passengers as Yoko Homa, others in San Francisco and Vancouver were keeping an eye on the ill-fated ship. With the German and British press reporting the incident even before it arrived in Vancouver, and the Canadian one reporting it daily after it landed, the Ghadar leaders dispersed across North America were well aware of the developments and sent their representatives to greet the ship. The large sums raised by the Indian community for litigation for feeding the passengers revealed the effective mobilization of the community by the political leadership. The party's investment in the ship and its passengers reveals an amazing network of party workers in a position to assist them at every port of call. It's on the return journey that Sohan Singh Bhaktina's involvement through supply of arms becomes explicit, as does the Ghadar party's open call to arms. The next subheading is the Ingress into India Ordinance. While Canada, am I okay for time? I have 4 pages left. 5. While Canada introduced the continuous journey regulation to control Asian invasion, the British, concerned with the movements of Sikhs and Ghadar revolutionaries, explained their shadowing the passage of the ship as well as individual passengers. On its return to Budge, the arrest of its passengers without conclusive evidence of their Ghadar involvement and monitoring of their activities in their home villages for several years shows the domestic, in addition to international regulations through which immobility regimes regulate flows of people. The British Indian immobility regime regulated the flows of the subject through a new legislation, the Ingress Act, which gave the British government powers to arrest persons deemed dangerous. The release of confidential material on the British Indian government's list of dangerous persons aboard the Kamagata Maru and its plans to arrest them on their arrival in Calcutta justifies the apprehensions Gurjit Singh and his followers had about the actions of the government. The Ingress into India Ordinance dated 17 September 1914 that lays down orders for the treatment of persons, quote, not being foreigners who enter the Presidency of Bengal by sea or land, which are meant to meet cases known as undesirables, unquote. While the ordinance recognizes that the right to prohibit entry would be inappropriate in the case of British subjects, it states that the course is desirable, quote, in order to protect the state from the prosecution of some purpose prejudicial to its safety, interest, or tranquility. The Ingress into India Ordinance, which draws on a similar ordinance against foreigners, whose clauses are sufficiently widely drawn to cover every method of restriction, applying in the extreme case to confinement, is underpinned by the idiom of immobility. Statements of British officials reveal that the British Indian government hastily reformulated the Ingress Act to curtail the activities of Gurjit Singh and other Ghadar leaders and had a plan of action to detain certain passengers on their arrival, which was not committed to writing. The officers in charge appear to be following the procedure laid down in the ordinance about those arriving by sea by meeting all vessels that are likely to carry undesirables, have an arrangement in place with authorities in the Far East, early warning of any vehicles who might have undesirable persons on board, detain only undesirable persons, and not cause inconvenience to the innocent, the undesirable person. An examination of the reports of the Inquiry Committee, witnesses' statements, and descendant memoirs demonstrates that the state could legitimize its unwarranted actions, such as the search of passengers in the ship, their deportation to their home villages on a special train, the budge firing, and the subsequent detention only through their criminalization as dangerous elements. The passengers' criminalization is established through unsubstantiated evidence of circulation and possession of Ghadar newspapers, alleged presence of Ghadar leaders, and delivery of lectures, seditious statements made by Gurjit Singh and other leaders, most of all, the possession of firearms and other dangerous weapons. The elaborate measures taken by the state to detain the returnees ostensibly on the basis of the request made by the ship's captain, Yamamoto, to the British consul in Kobe makes the testimony of the apparently neutral crew of the ship, particularly that of Yamamoto, particularly crucial to incriminating Gurjit Singh and other leaders. A cursory examination of the witness statements reveals that the interrogation of the ship's crew, Captain Yamamoto, first engineer, first officer, and mate, is strongly slanted towards criminalizing Gurjit Singh as a dangerous person through close-ended questions about his antecedents, permission to land in Vancouver, provisioning of the ship, exaction of contribution, treatment of the crew and other passengers, seditious statements and speeches, and the presence of firearms. Unlike the guarded, tentative assertions of the first engineer, the first officer and others about their interpretation of what they witnessed on the ship, Captain Yamamoto's testimony, notwithstanding his ignorance of Punjabi and limited command over English, personal antagonism toward Gurjit Singh, biased sources of information, assumption errors, and subjective interpretation implicate Gurjit Singh and the other leaders in acts that would justify his detention. It is Captain Yamamoto's testimony that is being used to establish Gurjit Singh and others as most dangerous persons, calling for the implementation of the Ingress Act. Captain Yamamoto alleges that Gurjit Singh did not provide adequate amount of food to the passengers, but extracted collections, prevented Ban Singh from landing in Vancouver and the Japanese crew from sailing fired shots in Vancouver and asked the captain to procure 12 pistols through his steward and received a large amount of money from the British consul in Kobe. While acknowledging he had no knowledge of Punjabi and limited competence in English, he claims that Gurjit Singh was extravagant, consumed liquor, used seditious language and speeches on the ship, and confided to him that he planned an armed uprising on his return. He confirms that the newspaper Hindustani was brought into the ship in Vancouver, and that Bhag Singh and Rahim instigated Gurjit Singh, that Jawahir Mal and Narain Das boarded the ship in Kobe and made seditious speeches to the passengers and told him that they were bent on creating a revolution in India, and that 200 pistols brought in a box in Yokohama, which were intended to be used but were thrown into the sea after the stopover in Singapore. Alleging that the older of two passengers who boarded the ship in Kobe was the most dangerous, and informing him that they were going to have a revolution on their return and create trouble, and the passengers going to riot, he alerts the British consul at Kobe to send a telegram to Kolkata requesting for a guard to be sent along with the pilot. Nowhere does the captain claim to have personally witnessed the alleged occurrences, but to have based his interpretation on hearing about them from passengers who couldn't speak English. Never does the committee keep in view that Captain Yamamoto was himself an aggrieved party, with Gurjit Singh having complained against him as his source, Ban Singh, the leader of the party opposed to Gurjit Singh, and that all his statements are prefixed by the phrase, "I did not see, but heard," or that he had no personal knowledge. The most incriminating bit of evidence about the 200 pistols brought in Yokohama is based on the authority of Ban Singh. So Ban Singh appears to be a rival of Gurjit Singh. Is that right? Anybody know?
Ban Singh was one of the two principal critics.
Okay.
Of one of the passengers and one of two principal critics.
So a biased voice. Unlike the first officer, S. Miyazi, who corroborates Captain Yamamoto's suspicions about the seditious content of the lectures delivered by Gurjit Singh, his revolutionary intents, the two passengers who boarded the ship at Kobe, the number of firearms smuggled in at Yokohama, the distribution of gutter newspapers, the first engineer, Shiozaki, is hesitant in making categorical judgments and contradicts the captain by stating that no firearms were used against the police in Vancouver, even though other sharp weapons were made on the ship. Unlike the other two, who based their inferences on what they heard, he confesses to not having a knowledge of English and makes a clear distinction between what he saw and what he heard. While he agrees that lectures were delivered after the ship left Kobe by Gurjit Singh and the others, and red books were distributed, he claims to be ignorant of their seditious nature and denies knowledge of passengers being hostile to the government and their intentions of creating trouble. While acknowledging that he heard talks about firearms being brought in Yokohama, he does not confirm the number and places the number of pistols in the passengers' possession to about 4 or 5. Remember, it was 200 earlier. Like Shiozaki, Miyazi, too, does not think that the passengers intended to create trouble on arrival, but claims to have heard that firearms were thrown overboard in the last minute of the journey. The discrepancy in the number of pistols available to the passengers cited by the captain and his crew, and tentativeness in commenting on events that are believed to have transpired, cast doubts on the objectivity of Yamamoto's incriminating testimony. Considering none of them understood Punjabi and spoke English, the seditious content of these statements and speeches made by Gurjit Singh and other leaders may be inferred on the basis of reports of other passengers, often with vested interest. It is clear that the closed questions put to the captain and the crew are designed to establish Gurjit Singh not only as a person of dubious credentials who exploited the passengers for personal gain, and to confirm the intervention of gutter leaders such as Bhagwan Singh, Barkatullah, Jawahir Mal, and Narain Das. As the British Indian state's action on the passengers' arrival in Baj can be justified only through evidence of the presence of dangerous persons on board the Kamagata Maru, the British officials entrusted with the implementation of the ordinance are required to prove the presence of undesirable persons. Based on the suspicions of the Japanese capital, Dr. Raghunath Singh's letter, Ban Singh's word, they set out to meet the ship reportedly carrying 8 undesirable persons and compel the passengers to return home in a special train. The reception party consisted of the Police Commissioner of Bengal, the Deputy Police Commissioner of Punjab, the District Magistrate, and so on, provides an inkling into the resources invested in intercepting 8 passengers. A number of them confessed having no knowledge of the ship carrying firearms or active revolutionaries, deem it essential to have met the ship because they believed it could carry persons who could be considered dangerous to the tranquility of the country. The elaborate search carried on by the Punjab police does not reveal the presence of firearms or seditious literature. The British officials' perception of certain passengers as undesirable or dangerous is entirely based on biased statements of the disgruntled faction consisting of Ban Singh, Raghunath Singh, 17 Muslims who claim to have been ill-treated by Gurjit Singh. The seditious intentions of the passengers are surmised through the discovery of a gutter booklet. Their insolent body language and the use of disrespectful Hindi term and refusal to board the special train. You know what? I might need a minute and a half. While the officials are determined to establish Gurjit Singh's fraudulent enterprise on the basis of his promise to the passengers that they would be allowed to land in Canada, neither the crew nor the passengers, except the disgruntled few, have any grievances against Gurjit Singh. The genuine fears of the passengers about being taken to an unknown destination and the just intentions to request the authorities to appoint a commission to hear their grievances are interpreted as signs of sedition. The intercepted telegram by Gurjit Singh calling for an agitation on the ship's arrival in Calcutta and unconfirmed information about his intention to begin an armed rising is used to brand him as an undesirable character. Despite the visibility being low and only a small number of firearms being found, the detained, wounded, or dead Sikhs, the British officials insist that the Sikhs began firing and fired 30 to 40 rounds and that they merely retaliated in self-defense. Not only that, the Sikhs captured on their way to escape were also alleged to be carrying arms and firing shots. Conclusion. If the passengers' exclusion from the host countries depended on their being labeled as aliens, they were secluded as home as undesirables. Vancouver aliens, India undesirables. A set of laws that allowed states to categorize and track individuals deemed to be dangerous so that they can be secluded. The deportation of the passengers from Hong Kong using the argument of vagrancy and from Calcutta citing their possession of insufficient funds brought the unemployed, the unemployable, or the destitute under the category of punishable behavior. Failing to find concrete evidence of their involvement in the seditious act, the state used the war as an emergency to express its sovereignty to exclude undesirables within India. The securitization argument and the objective of defending territorial sovereignty was offered as the rationale for the sequestration of the passengers on their return for several years. A large number of the passengers were imprisoned for several years. Those who willingly returned to Punjab were kept under surveillance. Those who went to hiding were hunted down. The demonization of the Sikh after 1984 and the sequestration of Sikhs citing the security of the Indian state and the regulation of Sikh movements reiterates the emergence of an enclave society. The paradigm of suspicion that led to the perception of every Sikh as a terrorist led to the immobilization of the flows overseas. While a number of Sikhs exploited the situation to enter Europe, America, Canada, and Australia as asylum seekers, the grudging citizenship accorded them by host societies and the recent violence against Punjabi migrants that the stranger would continue to be excluded from the space of multiculturalism as he was in imperialism. Thank you.
Thank Thank you, Doris, for reading Anjali's paper. I have 10 minutes, and you have listened to two contrasting perspectives, how a Canadian scholar looks at the same incidents from a very sympathetic way, and how an Indian scholar looks at the same material, what happened in India, in another way. So you are free to ask questions now.
There is a point that I will want to make at some time during this conference. I might as well get it out of the way now. And it came up in his paper. And the point has to do with the right of subjects of the British Empire to enter a British country. And I raise it because it is a question of how you do research. Because the ideal is that you look at everything you can, and you look at every source you can in context. I mean, I get training in this all the time because my wife loves to watch television murder mysteries. And I see them going through this, and the first bit of evidence leads them here, and the second goes there, and they have to get the whole picture. On the right to enter any part of the British Empire, if you're a British subject, I want to remind you of a couple of things. The first is, what is an empire? An empire is an area dominated by one country. More than that, it's not dominated simply by one country, it is dominated by an elite within that country. And it serves the purpose of that elite. And you can go through the empires to the beginning, whether it's the Macedonians or the Persians or whatever, it's an aristocratic warrior elite. In Britain, it is the British aristocracy, I'm not exaggerating, who dominated that empire, and it served their purposes. And one of the things that drove that empire out of existence was extending the vote to the whole of the British population, including women, which happened in the 20th century. So that's the first point. The second point is that Britain itself, as the imperial country, we always learned in school, and it's true to the present, has no written constitution. So there is no Bill of Rights, as in the United States, to appeal to. As a matter of fact, British did not have the right to travel from one end of the British Isles to the other. I'm a student of the British Poor Laws, and the paupers who ended up in parishes which didn't want them could be sent back home. So you couldn't go wherever you wanted. The British, in the period that I was studying, at the beginning of the 19th century, passed a law to prevent artisans from emigrating because they wanted to keep them at home. So there was not the right to leave the country. It wasn't much enforced, which explains how artisans, but there was no way, there was no challenge to that in principle. So the idea that a British subject has a right as a member of an empire to go anywhere in the empire defies the reality of an empire. It's not there to serve them. It's there to serve a small elite. Where do we find that statement? We find it made by Sikhs and other South Asians in Canada after the barrier was established in 1908, and it got articulated with greater refinement in time. So you can now go back to a document and you can find a passage in which that's stated, and you can copy it into your text when you write your essay or whatever. But this is reality. Thank you. So if at the time of the Kamagata Maru, right, he was only involved in that sense. But he was there and present and would have known everything that was going on. I don't see Munshi Singh's name specifically, but he was there. He was part of the Gurdwara community. So he is, as much as everybody else in Vancouver, he was definitely part of it.
Can you say what your take is on Captain Yamamoto?
Yes, I think he survived a very difficult experience, and probably as well as he could. And you know, this is from the time they got on that ship. It's half a year till they got off, and actually then he was held in Calcutta while this commission of inquiry went on. So he had to get along with the Sikhs on board. And he also had to get along with officials. He was one person who could go ashore. He was talking to officials, he was telling them things, but I think he was worried about himself and his crew. So he did report on the revolvers coming on board the ship. It's also said that he helped behind them. You know, and that comes from some of this testimony. So his role has to be that of someone seeking to survive.
And one of the things in closing you said was, where did this negativity come from? These were good-hearted people. You know, they came from very tight-knit communities that were surviving as settlers themselves. And they knew very little about India at the time. But what about the notion of colonialism? I mean, they knew of difference because they knew of the Aboriginal people who had been displaced, who continued to live alongside. Early part of the 20th century, the numbered treaties in Ontario was still being negotiated and signed. So there was the process of Canadian colonization was still in formation. So they knew of difference. They knew also of the wouldn't you say that they knew of the racial hierarchy that existed at the time in terms of how white settlers fit in with Aboriginal people who were being displaced?
Well, you're speaking in terms and with vocabulary that they wouldn't have used.
Oh, absolutely.
And you recognize that.
Yeah.
Yes, they knew of the existence of of Indians in the country. When I was a boy, and the Reader's Digest was lying around the house, I remember one article, and it was from the 1940s, The Disappearing Red Man. And the number of First Nations people from the time of contact fell remorselessly over the centuries right down to about 1939. And you may well know that in the 20th century, late 19th century, certainly in British Columbia and across Canada, tuberculosis was a principal reason. And somehow or other, that was turned around so that within my lifetime, I'm reading about the disappearing red man, and then I'm seeing the rejuvenation and the new assertiveness of the First Nations people. Not that they weren't stating their claims all along, but it would be very easy for a farming family in southern Ontario to be more or less oblivious about First Nations people. There was the Iroquois Reserve in Brantford, which was about 50 miles away. And what they might have appreciated about them was they had a heroic history. Their knowledge would have been very elementary and school text-like. So I was alluding to the principal dividing line in much of Canada, and it was Catholic Protestant or French English. That was really sharp, and that would come right down to the latter part of the 20th century. The idea of your Protestant daughter marrying a Catholic, that really disturbed a lot of people. So now you can see in that there is a very inherent bigotry. It can be translated into in other directions. It's not that these people were free of bigotry. I'm saying they have no exposure to people from other parts of the world. They know very little about them. They've got no pre-existing notions about them.
Well, I guess it's not fair to ask questions about a paper written.
Yeah.
So
we have lots of people here that might know.
Yeah, well, and this is just to give you an opportunity perhaps to tie the papers together. So if you could maybe add to your cast of characters, some of the students that have held on here.
Yeah.
So Hopkinson on the Anglo-Canadian side.
Yes.
Tell a little bit about his life, his role, both as a Canadian intelligence and immigration officer, and also his past, his connection with the surveillance and all the issues raised in the second paper.
So
and then, if you can take the other side, and those that Hopkinson considered his enemies, so those who were mobilizing the guitar movement in Vancouver, or if you want to speak about any of the activists on Kamagata Maru, you can take
the danger is I'm liable to speak for too long. and okay, good. And I had on my list here a pairing of Hopkinson and Hussein Rahim, you'll be familiar with. But Hussein Rahim was a leading figure in the Vancouver Sikh community. And I was thinking of them as a kind of a pair, although they're on the other side of things. They are people with suppressed identities. So they have that in common. Now, Hopkinson, not everyone here will know, but he was an immigration officer from 1909, early on in the year, until his death. He was shot and killed in Vancouver after the Kamagata Maru left in 1914. And he had been a Calcutta policeman. And he was hired by the Canadian government to act as an immigration officer and also to conduct surveillance work in British Columbia, and he extended that. It was North America. So the one question arises: how did he? Why was he here? How did he get here? And the community at the time was convinced that the Indian government had sent him. So I have tried to pin that one down throughout my connection with this story. And it's quite clear to me that he came on his own, which makes him interesting to me. I label him another Indian immigrant, and I can call him an Indian immigrant because half of his, maybe more, of his ancestry was Indian. So, or you mentioned Anglo-Indian, a term used to describe people of mixed ancestry from India. And that is nearly everybody here will know what I'm saying, but that is a minority community, identifiable community in India right down to the present, the Anglo-Indians. And I say that almost more vigorously. I say that he was Anglo-Indian because he denied it. And he denied it, although his I interviewed one of the people who worked beside him and told me he was Anglo-Indian. How do you know? You just had to look at it. That sort of judgment. But more telling is when I got help from genealogists, and one couldn't do it all online. So genealogists had helped me find his birth information, and he came up with his baptismal certificate, and it was Allahabad. It was not Yorkshire, as he claimed when he filled out his form. So he's denying where he was born, and he insisted that he was English. So that's in his background. And within the last few years, I discovered that he was married in India before he came to Canada. And his wife died within a year. And then he immigrated to Canada. And in Canada, he married an English woman. Well, I'd always known about her. I had not known about the earlier marriage. The obituary says nothing about the earlier marriage. It says nothing about a family in India, and I'm not surprised. Either his English wife in Canada did not know it, or she suppressed it. I think she didn't know it. I don't think he ever told her that he'd been married before. So he came on his own, and I see him as an immigrant coming on his own, and I see him as an immigrant coming following the death of his wife. And I see it as an emotional response. And he's coming to Canada like all other immigrants for opportunity, and then he made a job for himself. That job happened to be a surveillance job. He was here for quite a few months. He was here for over a year before he actually got that immigration job. But he naturally gravitated to the Indian Sikh community. And then he began to do interpreting work. And anyway, that's in part, I should stop there. But you have Hopkinson in the immigration department and with this most exceptional job, but a job I think he managed to create for himself by telling the authorities what was going on in the Sikh community.